Hey YA, thank you so much for being here tonight. We're so glad you made us a part of your weekend. If you're new here, we'd love to connect with you. Come check out our Connect Center in the foyer right after this experience. You can also connect with us on social media on Instagram and YouTube. If you brought children with you tonight, we have kids experiences up through 5th grade. Go ahead and find an usher in the foyer and they'll help you find Kids Check-In. Well, are you ready? This experience starts in 30 seconds.
What's up, Life Center? Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Garrett. I'm the young adults pastor here at Life Center. So glad that you're joining us tonight. Hey, this evening we're doing something a little bit different than normal. Because of the weather, we felt that it would just be wise, out of an abundance of caution, to instead cancel our gatherings. And then this evening, instead, just present this talk online. And so I'm here live in our studio. Want to welcome you. Thanks so much for joining us this evening, wherever you're watching from. Want you to know this, as you're watching, if at any point in time tonight you've got a prayer request or something like that you want to share with our team, you can go ahead and type it into the chat. Josh, our technical arts pastor, and a few of our other team members are going to be interacting with you throughout the evening. So we want you to know we're here for you, but just felt that this would be a wise thing to do tonight. So this is fun. It's a little bit different, but I'm really, really excited that you're joining us tonight. This evening, we're continuing our series titled Uncommon Joy. Hopefully you were here with us last week. Maybe you want to check out the podcast. We began to lay a foundation for what biblical joy looks like. And we wrestled with this idea that sometimes it's really difficult to choose joy in the middle of a frustrating circumstance, but sometimes it's helpful if we can choose to build a better foundation for our joy. And this evening, I'm excited to continue this series with you tonight. This evening, we're going to launch right in out of the book of Philippians. We're going to turn to chapter 1. And so if you have a Bible or maybe you want to open another tab on your computer while you're watching, we're going to start in Philippians chapter 1 tonight. As you're turning there, I want to ask you this really, really important question. The media team's going to help me out. They'll show this image on the screen here in just one second. I'd like you to answer this question. Say it out loud. You're in your living room. You're someplace safe right now. Say it out loud. What color is this dress? What color is this thing? Is it blue? Is it white? What color is this dress? I remember about a year or so ago, this dress broke the internet. This image started circulating all around online, and everybody started chiming in with all of these different opinions and dissenting points of view on what color this dress was. I remember my wife and I got in like a 4-week argument because she was convinced it was one color and I saw things a little bit differently. I remember people were getting in screaming matches on Twitter with each other, and some individuals would chime in with these bogus psychological arguments saying that if you saw this color, it said this about your type of personality, or maybe some sort of social disorder that you had because you saw the dress one color. I think I even saw somebody one time, they said that Ted Bundy and Hitler would have seen the dress as one color, and so if you saw the dress the same color they did, you must have been just like them. It was absolutely ridiculous, all of the arguments that we got in. But here's the truth that we learned through this odd social experiment over a year or so ago with this dress. The reality is this: it's all just a matter of perspective. See, what you view this dress to be, it's all determined on how things work with your eyes. And you might see things one way, but somebody else, there might be a completely different perspective that they viewed this dress from, and so they believed that it was white. Well, you said, no, you're crazy, this dress is blue. It's all a matter of perspective. But here's the challenge that we run into in life oftentimes, is that our perception is our reality. Maybe you don't agree with that statement, but maybe you would agree with this. Our perception of reality is what informs our actions. See, what you and I do, how we behave, how we act, it is all based on what we perceive to be true about the world around us, the reality that we have constructed in our minds. That's why many years ago, Ross and Rachel spent seasons arguing about whether or not they were on a break, because she didn't think they were, but Ross was convinced they were on a break. And his perception of their reality informed his actions, and he made some pretty foolish decisions because of it. See, our perception of reality is so important. And what I love is this. Tonight I want to make the case to you that uncommon joy requires an uncommon perspective. And that uncommon perspective is this: uncommon joy looks to Jesus. Not to circumstance, not to what's going on around us, but uncommon joy looks to Jesus. What I love about Paul here in the book of Philippians is that Paul looks to Jesus in the midst of his circumstance. And in the middle of looking to his circumstance, in the middle of looking to Jesus in his circumstance, he's able to experience uncommon joy. And so in Philippians 1, verse 12, we'll read this together. Paul begins to lay out this idea for an uncommon perspective. He says this, he says, "I want you to know, brothers, that what's happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, now are much more bold to speak the word without fear." He says in verse 15, "Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here," catch this, "for the defense of the gospel." See, Paul's perspective on his circumstance is so uncommon. And I believe it's uncommon because he has clarity on three things. And I want to unpack those tonight. The first thing I believe Paul has clarity on is this. Paul has an uncanny amount of clarity on his assignment. That's my first point tonight. If you're taking notes, you want to write that down. Assignment. See, there's something he says in verse 12 that I think is so profound, so astounding. He says, "I want you to know, brothers, that what happened to me, this imprisonment, this awful circumstance that I've now found myself in, it's really happened to serve to advance the gospel." See, Paul has incredible clarity on his assignment. It's the advance, he says in verse 12, and then in verse 16, the defense of the gospel. How many of y'all know this? There's nothing worse than a lack of clarity on your assignment. There's nothing worse than not knowing what someone wants from you. We watched the movie The Notebook. It's my wife's favorite movie. I still can't figure out why. This crazy love story between these two individuals that get separated over a season of time, and the love feels unrequited for a long season of time, and finally they're able to come back together, and they have this wonderful moment of embrace, but then there's an argument, and then inevitably it ends with Ryan Gosling with his huge beard looking into the girl whose name I can't remember's eyes, and he says to her, "What do you want?" And she looks back and she says, "I don't know," which reminds me of every time my wife and I go out for food on a Friday night, and I look at her and I say, "Babe, what do you want?" And she said, "I don't know. Do you want teriyaki? Do you want sushi? Do you want lasagna? What do you want? I will give it to you unless it's Olive Garden. I will not take you there. What do you want? I'll give you what you want. I just need to know what it is that you want from me." Maybe you're a college student and you've identified with this, because there's nothing worse than ambiguity on an assignment. You get an assignment to write an essay or to do a report on something, but there's a lack of clarity in the details for what's expected of you. There's nothing worse than lack of clarity on an assignment. See, here's the problem is a lack of clarity on our assignment. It births frustration in us because we don't know how to be proactive. But not only that, it also births hopelessness, depression, and exhaustion because now we don't know how to be reactive. Have you ever met somebody who was anxious and exhausted all the time because they were just trying to react to everything around them, trying to spin all of these plates, trying to run around putting out fires all the time because they thought that everything was their assignment? I learned this many years ago from a friend. This is a great leadership lesson. See, when we understand our assignment properly, we know what fires to start, we know what fires to just ignore, and then we know what fires we need to put out. See, good leaders know when they need to dump energy into something and they need to start a fire. They need to get things moving. They know what fires they can just ignore because they'll go out on their own. It's just a distraction. It's just noise. You don't need to pay it a lot of attention. But good leaders also know that, hey, there are some fires. I need to take action. I need to squash this right now before it becomes destructive. When we don't know our assignment, sometimes it's challenging because we don't know what fires we need to put out. But Paul's understanding of his assignment births joy. He says this later on as we continue reading through chapter 1. He says this in verse 18. He says, "What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice." Paul finds joy knowing that the assignment is going forward. He talks about these other teachers who are preaching maybe out of some faulty motives. They have some bad reasoning for why they're spreading the gospel of Christ. But in this moment, Paul's able to discern that these other teachers weren't actually hindering the assignment. So he's able to overlook their faults and in doing so resist distraction and exhaustion. Now, there are other times in his letters to the church where he issues a pretty firm rebuke to some false teachers that are hindering the assignment, but this isn't one of those times. He has clarity on his assignment, and because he knows that the assignment is still going forward, it's still moving down the field, he's able to experience joy. See, Paul, understanding his assignment, gives him the ability to adjust his perspective. And in taking up this uncommon perspective, he experiences an uncommon joy. We have to have clarity on our assignment. Second of all, we need this. We need clarity on our anticipation. Maybe you want to write that down. Our anticipation. See, verse 20 and 21 of chapter 1 of Philippians begin to speak to this. It says this, "It's my eager expectation. It's my hope that I will not be ashamed at all." Here's what he's anticipating, that with full courage now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. I love this. Live or die. Either way, Paul is anticipating a good thing. Paul has optimism, right? Optimism, this is, Webster defines optimism, it's hopefulness, it's confidence about the future or the successful outcome of something. Oftentimes in life we wrestle or we swing between these areas of optimism and total pessimism. Is the glass half full or is it half empty? This mug of coffee is not full enough, apparently. See, it's all a perspective. Is it half full? Is it half empty? Last week we talked a little about this idea of trust. Philippians 1:6 says, I'm sure of this, I'm confident of this, I can trust that he who began a good work in me will carry it to completion. See, when we trust Jesus, we then have something to be optimistic about, and we can anticipate a good thing. Let me be totally vulnerable with you for a moment. This is very hard for me because at heart, I am a skeptic. The way my brain often works is that if something can go wrong, it probably will. I have a hard time overlooking improbable odds, but I'm reminded of what Hebrews 11 begins to talk about, that Abraham was promised to be the father of nations, and he's still childless at an old age. The odds are stacked against him. The Israelites were promised freedom, but they're pursued by the Egyptians who they escaped from, and then they're marched right up to the wall of the Red Sea. Gideon was supposed to lead a militant revolution, but instead he has to reduce his army by almost 75%. David has to take on a giant with a slingshot. The odds were not in their favor, but yet by faith, they were able to anticipate that God would work out all things for their good. See, when we have clarity on the uncommon things that we can anticipate, our perspective begins to change. When we have clarity on this, we get faith, right? And faith is just an uncommon perspective. It's the assurance of things unseen. It's anticipation of victory before the game even begins. When we have clarity on what we can anticipate from a loving God who's the giver of all good gifts, our perspective begins to outweigh, not just inform, but outweigh our present reality. And we begin to walk forward in faith with an uncommon joy. If we want to have an uncommon perspective that looks to Jesus in the midst of circumstance, we have to have clarity on our assignment, what it is that we're called and purposed to do. We have to have clarity on our anticipations. What is it that we have faith for? And lastly, we have to have clarity on our heir. are air, spelled A-I-R. Not Leona Lewis, not how am I gonna breathe with no air, not any of the breath in our lungs we pour. No, not that air. Have you ever heard anyone say this? They say he or she, they have a certain air about themselves. He carries himself with an air of confidence, or maybe he carries himself with an air of arrogance, right? See, air, Webster defines it this way. Air is kind of one of those funny words that has a dual meaning in the English language. It says this: air is the impression or a quality or manner given by someone or something. The question you have to ask yourself is this, is what air are you putting off? Or if you want to be kind of weird, what does the air smell like around you? Look at Philippians 1:27. We carry on in this chapter. Paul begins to conclude this first chapter of his letter to the church in Philippi, but with this idea. He says this in 1:27. It says, only let your manner, let the air that you put off, let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or I'm absent, I may hear of you that you're standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. See, here's the truth, friends. It's not just my perspective that needs to be uncommon. It's not just my perspective that needs to shift, but as a follower of Jesus, I have a scriptural mandate to live my life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. And in doing this, you and I, we put off an air that shifts the perspective of those around us. See, it's not just enough for me to have an uncommon perspective that looks to Jesus. Rather, my uncommon perspective should help point others to Jesus as well. Uncommon joy doesn't just stop with me. It's meant to be shared. I want to give you some reflection questions. Maybe you want to jot these down. You can wrestle with them later on this week. Or maybe you want to just take a moment after this talk concludes here in about 2 minutes or so, and you just want to have some personal reflection time. I want to give you a few things to chew on. The first question I have for you is this, is do I have clarity on my assignment? Are you putting energy into the right things? Are you lacking joy because you've been wasting time working on the wrong assignment? Do you have clarity on your assignment? Second question for you is this, is are you anticipating good things? Or are you, kind of like me sometimes, are you always assuming the worst? Maybe the homework assignment for you this week, while you're snowed in at your house, maybe you need to spend a little bit more time in Scripture, getting some clarity on the good things that you can anticipate from that good God who loves you. The Word says that His yoke is easy and His burden is light. He gives good gifts. That doesn't mean that life is all roses and that there are no bad days. In fact, Scripture actually suggests the opposite. What it means is that you and I can anticipate that there are better days ahead of us. Are you anticipating good things? And lastly, does the air around you need to change? Maybe you need to ask yourself this question: how can I leverage my circumstance to defend, to advance the gospel? I want to pray for you real quick. I want to say thanks so much for joining us this evening. Again, I hope that you stay safe this week. I hope that you're cuddled up with some hot cocoa by a fire and that you have a wonderful week. We will see you next Sunday night right back here at our central campus at our normal time of 7 o'clock. Let me pray for you. Jesus, be with my friends. God, thank you so much that you give us your joy. That's what the book of John says. You give to us your joy, a joy that the world cannot take away. God, we are so grateful that you are working inside of us to change our perspective, our outlook on life. God, to change the way that we view our circumstance. Jesus, I pray that you would help us to look to you in the middle of bad, dark days. God, I pray that you would help us to get clarity on our assignment, clarity on what we can anticipate with you, and clarity on how we're to live as citizens of heaven. What should the air around us be like? Jesus, thanks for who you are. We love you so much. In your name, amen. Hey, thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next week.